The arena was packed long before the first punch was thrown. Every seat filled, every aisle buzzing. The air itself felt electric, thick with noise, anticipation, and the unspoken promise of violence. This was boxing at its peak. No distractions, no sentimentality. People didn't come here for speeches. They came to see dominance, knockouts, blood, glory. When Muhammad Ali walked into the arena, the noise doubled. It always did. Some cheered him like a hero. Others booed him with the same intensity. Ali was never neutral. He was too loud, too confident, too unapologetic to be ignored. Even before the bell rang, he controlled the room. Cameras followed him. Commentators leaned forward. The crowd knew they were watching more than just a fighter. They were watching an event. This fight had been marketed the same way boxing always is. Power versus power. Pride versus pride. The posters promised destruction. The commentary promised fireworks. Fans debated how long it would last 3 rounds. 5. A brutal finish felt inevitable. Nobody discussed mercy. Nobody discussed restraint. Boxing, after all, is not the place people expect compassion. As the fighters stood in their corners, the tension tightened. Gloves adjusted. Mouth guards set. Eyes locked. The referee went through instructions everyone already knew. Protect yourself at all times. Obey my commands. When I say break, break. Routine words spoken hundreds of times before, words that assumed one thing above all else. The fight would continue until someone could not. The bell rang and the crowd erupted. This was the moment they paid for. Fists flew. Footwork echoed across the canvas. Every punch drew a reaction. Gasps, cheers, shouts. Ali moved with his signature rhythm, light on his feet, confident, almost playful. He looked like he belonged there more than anyone else in the building. Like this chaos was his natural environment, and for a while, everything unfolded exactly as expected. This was a fight, nothing more. No one in the audience imagined that history was approaching, not through a knockout, not through a collapse, but through a decision. A choice. Something so rare in boxing that most fans wouldn't even recognize it when it happened, because boxing doesn't stop for action. It doesn't pause for empathy. It rewards those who push harder, hit faster, finish stronger. That's the contract everyone accepts when they buy a ticket. No one in that arena knew the fight would stop. Not because someone fell, not because someone quit, but because one man standing at the center of all that noise. All that expectation would decide on his own terms. That winning was not the most important thing anymore, and when that moment came, it would silence a crowd that came for punches, and leave them staring at something far more powerful. By this point in his life, Muhammad Ali was no longer just fighting opponents in the ring. He was fighting time, expectation, and a public that could never decide whether to worship him or tear him apart. The early years when speed felt endless and confidence looked effortless were behind him. Every appearance now carried weight. Every fight felt like a verdict. The pressure was enormous. Ali was expected to prove again and again that he was still the greatest. Critics watched closely for decline. Journalists searched for signs of weakness, lower footwork, fading reflexes, hesitation. One bad performance wouldn't just be a loss. It would be labeled as the beginning of the end. At this stage, Ali wasn't allowed to be human. He was required to be legendary every single night. The media narrative reflected that cruelty. Headlines were sharper now. Praise came with conditions. Wins were minimized. Mistakes were magnified. Some framed him as a fading star, clinging to past glory. Others still painted him as arrogant, loud, and defiant, luring to age quietly or bow out gracefully. The same traits that once made him magnetic were now used to question his judgment. Publicly, Ali remained Ali. The poetry, the bravado, the grin that suggested absolute control. To the crowd, he looked unchanged, still dancing, still talking, still commanding attention without asking for it. That image mattered. It was armor. because underneath it, the reality was far more complex. Privately, Ali carried years of wear, physically and emotionally. He had been hit more than most fighters of his era. He had lived under a microscope. He had paid personal costs for his beliefs, for standing firm when silence would have been easier. Those experiences reshaped him. They deepened him. They made him think differently about pain, both his own and others. This particular fight mattered more than usual because it sat at the intersection of all those pressures. A win would reinforce his relevance. A dominant performance would quiet doubters, at least temporarily. The stakes weren't just about rankings or titles. They were about identity. About proving to fans, to critics, maybe even to himself that he was still the man people paid to see. But that same weight also sharpened his awareness. Ali understood what the ring could take from a person. He knew how quickly one moment could alter a life forever. At this stage, he wasn't fighting blindly anymore. He was fighting with memory. With experience, with an understanding that consequences don't end when the bell rings. That is what made this night different. To the crowd, it was another high-profile bout. To the media, another test. To Ali, it was a moment where everything he had lived, fame, punishment, conviction, loss, came into the ring with him. And when the unexpected decision arrived, it didn't come from weakness or confusion. It came from clarity. From a man who had already won enough fights to understand that not every victory is decided by who stays standing last, across the ring stood a man who had trained his entire life for moments like this. He wasn't there by accident. He wasn't a placeholder. He was a professional fighter with pride, discipline, and something to prove. Nights like these don't belong only to legends, they belong to challengers who believe. Even quietly, that history can tilt in their favor. The opponent's background mattered because it shaped expectations. He was known as tough, durable, the kind of fighter who didn't fold easily. Not flashy, not poetic, just relentless. The type of man who could absorb punishment and keep coming forward. That alone made the matchup compelling. This wasn't supposed to be a quick night. This was supposed to be a grind. As the fighters waited for the bell, the tension thickened. Cornerman shouted, "Last instructions." Gloves were wiped down, eyes locked. The crowd leaned forward, sensing conflict before it even began. Every movement was amplified. Every breath felt louder. This was the moment where preparation ends and instinct takes over. There was trash talk, but not the playful kind. Not poetry. Not jokes. This was the serious, clipped language of men about to hurt each other. Some of it was spoken. Some of it was silent. Fighters communicate in glances as much as words. A nod. A stare held a second too long. A refusal to look away. The crowd fed off it. Cheers rose and fell in waves. Ali's supporters shouted his name. Others rooted for the upset, for the chaos of seeing a giant stumble. That tension, hero versus resistances, what makes boxing dangerous and addictive. People don't just want to see greatness. They want to see whether it can survive pressure. Everyone expected a hard fight. Commentators predicted attrition. Analysts talked about wear and tear. The assumption was simple. Punches would accumulate, damage would compound, and someone would eventually break. That's how these nights usually end. That's how boxing is designed. No one expected mercy. No one expected interruption, as the referee called both men to the center. His voice cut through the noise with familiar authority. Rules were repeated, instructions given, a final look exchanged. In that moment, both fighters understood the same truth. Once the bell rang, the world outside the ropes would disappear. And when the bell did ring, the energy exploded. This wasn't a slow burn. This was intensity from the start. The crowd roared at every exchange. Each landed punch drew a reaction. The opponent pressed forward, determined to show he belonged in that ring. And Muhammad Ali, as always, met that pressure with confidence, moving, calculating, responding. Everything about the atmosphere said one thing. This was going to be brutal. A test of endurance. A test of will. A test of who could impose their identity on the fight. That's why what happened next felt so unreal, because in a setting built entirely around aggression, something completely different was about to interrupt the script hand. No one, not even the men throwing punches, could have predicted it. The opening rounds unfolded exactly as everyone expected. The bell rang, and instinct took over. Footwork, timing, distance, this was boxing in its purest form. Nothing theatrical, nothing symbolic. Just two trained fighters testing each other punch by punch. Muhammad Ali moved with the rhythm that had defined his career. Light on his feet, circling, measuring. His hands were relaxed, his shoulders loose. He wasn't rushing. He never did. Ali had always treated the early rounds like a conversation, listening before responding. A jab here, a step back there. Data collection in motion. The opponent came forward with purpose. Guard high, chin tucked. He wasn't reckless, but he wasn't passive either. Each step forward was deliberate, meant to close space and test Ali's timing. When punches landed, they landed clean, not wild swings, but calculated shots thrown by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The commentators settled into analysis mode. They talked about foot placement, about head movement, about how Ali was controlling distance with his jab. There was nothing dramatic in their tone. Only familiarity. This was a normal fight, unfolding according to a script they had seen hundreds of times before. The crowd was fully locked in. Cheers rose when punches connected. Gasps followed close calls. The noise swelled and softened in rhythm with the exchanges. This was the entertainment they came for: skill, danger, competition balanced on a knife's edge. No one was restless. No one was confused. Everything made sense. Ali looked comfortable, confident, in control of the tempo. He wasn't chasing a knockout. He was managing the ring, steering the fight where he wanted it to go. His movements suggested experience rather than urgency. The kind of calm that only comes from having been here before, many times. Under brighter lights and heavier stakes dot between rounds, corners worked efficiently. Instructions were given. Water splashed. Cuts checked. The opponent's team encouraged pressure. Ali's corner emphasized patience. Nothing out of the ordinary. No raised voices. No panic. Just routine adjustments. From the outside, this fight looked like it would continue exactly this way round after round, until fatigue or damage tipped the balance. Analysts in the arena and viewers at home could already imagine the later rounds. The narrative was forming in real time. Ali's intelligence versus the opponent's toughness. Skill versus persistence. Nothing about the first rounds hinted at interruption. There were no signs of distress. No fouls, no injuries, no confusion. The referee moved smoothly, intervening only when necessary, then stepping aside. The machinery of boxing worked as it always does. Efficient, brutal, predictable. And that predictability is important because it's what made the coming moment so jarring at this stage. There was no reason, none at all, to believe the fight would stop for any reason other than exhaustion or defeat. The crowd leaned in, expecting escalation. More speed, more power, more damage. Everything was building toward intensity. Nothing unusual, not yet. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single punch, no dramatic stumble, no obvious signal that something was wrong. Instead, the shift came quietly, almost invisibly, noticed only by those watching closely. Muhammad Ali was still moving, still defending, still in control. But his rhythm changed. The bounce in his steps softened. The constant circling slowed just enough to feel intentional. His eyes stayed locked on his opponent longer than before, not in calculation, but in assessment. It was the look of a man thinking beyond the next exchange. Ali had always been expressive in the ring, confident, playful, taunting even. But now that showmanship faded. His face tightened, not with fear, but with focus, a deeper kind of concentration, as if he was weighing something heavier than strategy. The punches kept coming, but their meaning changed. Ali wasn't pressing an advantage. He wasn't escalating. When openings appeared, he didn't rush to exploit them. To a casual viewer, it might have looked like patience. To someone experienced, It looked like restraint. The referee noticed it first. He stayed closer than usual, watching Ali's movements, his posture, his reactions. Referees are trained to sense danger, to recognize fatigue, injury, or confusion. But this wasn't any of those. This was hesitation. Deliberate pauses between exchanges. A fighter choosing not to engage when he clearly could. The opponent felt it too. Pressure met less resistance. The fight's tempo flattened. That created uncertainty. In boxing, uncertainty is unsettling. Fighters rely on patterns. When those patterns break, instinct hesitates. The crowd began to murmur. It wasn't loud at first, just scattered confusion. People shifting in their seats. A few shouts urging action. From the stands, it felt like the fight had lost momentum for no clear reason. Fans didn't understand what they were seeing in. They didn't like it. Commentators stumbled slightly in their analysis. They pointed out the change, but couldn't explain it. Was Ali conserving energy? Setting a trap? Was he hurt? The questions piled up, but the answers didn't come. Ali stood his ground, eyes steady, breathing controlled. He looked composed to composed. Not like a man waiting to strike, but like someone waiting for permission, or clarity, or a decision to solidify. For the first time that night, the fight felt suspended between two realities. On one side, what everyone expected, violence escalating toward a finish. On the other, something unspoken, unresolved, and growing heavier with each second. The referee stepped closer again. A glance, a half gesture. Ali didn't respond with punches. He responded with eye contact. That's when the crowd's confusion deepened. Why wasn't he attacking? Why wasn't the fight moving forward? Why did it feel like something invisible had entered the ring? Boxing thrives on momentum. When momentum breaks, it demands explanation. But none was offered, at least not yet. All anyone could feel was that the night had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Something was about to happen that had nothing to do with winning a round end, everything to do with what kind of man was standing. In the center of that ring, then it happened. Not with a punch, not with a collapse, but with a step backward. Muhammad Ali disengaged. In a sport where fighters are trained to move forward, to press, to punish, to finish, Ali did the opposite. He took a clear step back, raised his hands slightly, and broke the rhythm of the fight on his own terms. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The movement wasn't defensive. It was intentional. For a split second, no one reacted. The opponent hesitated, unsure whether to advance or pause. Fighters are conditioned to respond to danger, not withdrawal. This wasn't weakness. This wasn't retreat. It was interruption, and it didn't fit any known pattern. The referee froze. His instincts told him to intervene. But there was no obvious reason to stop the action. No foul, no injury, no knockdown. He looked from Ali to the opponent, then back again, searching for clarity that wasn't there. This wasn't covered in the rulebook. The crowd noise began to fade, not instantly, but unevenly. Cheers dissolved into scattered shouts. Confusion rippled through the arena like a wave breaking apart. People leaned forward, trying to understand what they were seeing. Some yelled for action. Others fell silent, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Ali didn't move. He stood still, centered, calm. His hands lowered. His posture relaxed, not like a man surrendering, but like someone refusing to continue under the current terms. The ring, moments earlier, alive with motion, now felt suspended. The referee stepped in closer. Box. Right, he signaled instinctively. Then stopped himself. Ali wasn't engaging. That hesitation changed everything. The commentators scrambled. Their voices, once smooth and analytical, overlapped with uncertainty. They questioned whether Ali was hurt, whether there had been a misunderstanding, whether the referee should step in. Their words came faster now, less confident, trying to fill a silence that felt too heavy for explanation. Cameras zoomed in. Ali's face told no story of pain or panic. There was no distress, only resolve. The kind that doesn't shout, but doesn't bend either. The opponent looked toward the referee, then back at Ali. This wasn't what he had trained for. This wasn't a combination to counter or a tactic to solve. It was a pause, loaded with intention. And no one else in the ring knew how to respond. The arena. Once roaring, now hummed with disbelief, boxing fans understand chaos. They understand violence. They understand sudden endings. What they don't understand is choice. And that's why this moment landed so hard. Because in the middle of a fight, under bright lights, with thousands watching and millions more beyond the cameras, Muhammad Ali stopped everything without throwing a single punch. Not because he had to, but because he decided to. For the first time that night, nothing happened. No punches. No footwork. No instructions shouted from the corners. The ring stood still. Muhammad Ali remained motionless at center ring, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. The opponent stood a few steps away, gloves raised but frozen, unsure whether the moment required aggression or restraint. The referee hovered between them, uncertain which instinct to follow, and then the sound disappeared. What had been a wall of noise, cheers, shouts, whistles collapsed into near silence. Not the kind caused by shock alone, but by collective confusion. Thousands of people held their breath at once. Waiting for the world to resume its expected shape, cameras moved in closer. Directors abandoned wide, shots for tight frames, faces, eyes, sweat on brows. Ali's face filled screens around the arena and beyond it. There was no panic there. No grimace. Just stillness. Purposeful and heavy. In boxing, silence is unnatural. This is a sport built on impact. On rhythm, on the constant exchange of force. Even between rounds, there's noise advice shouted, crowds buzzing, music playing. But now, in the middle of action, there was nothing. Just the faint hum of lights overhead and the scuff of shoes on canvas. Fans leaned forward, afraid to miss anything that would explain what they were witnessing. Some whispered, some shook their heads. Others stared, unblinking. The silence wasn't comfortable. It demanded interpretation. The referee glanced toward ringside officials, searching for direction. None came. Everyone was watching Ali, waiting for him to move, waiting for him to speak, waiting for the rules of the night to reassert themselves. But they didn't. This pause stretched longer than a heartbeat, longer than protocol allows, and with every second, its meaning deepened. It became clear that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a delay. It was a statement made without words. The opponent lowered his guard slightly. Confusion softened into awareness. He realized the fight wasn't advancing because Ali wasn't willing to push it forward. Not now. Not like this. The crowd began to sense it too. This wasn't about strategy. This wasn't about injury. This was about choice, and choice has weight. In that silence, the arena felt smaller, more intimate. Thousands of individual reactions merged into a single shared moment of uncertainty. People didn't know whether to applaud, protest, or simply watch. Silence does something strange in spaces. It's built for noise. It forces attention. It removes distraction. It turns spectacle into meaning. That night, in a sport defined by force, the rarest thing in boxing took over the arena, a knockout. Not a comeback, not a scandal, but silence. And in that silence, everyone understood one thing clearly. Whatever was about to happen next would be remembered long after the final bell. Then Muhammad Ali made it unmistakable. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand. It wasn't a defensive gesture. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't confusion. It was a signal. In boxing, raised hands usually mean victory, protest, or surrender, never interruption. Yet this gesture carried none of those meanings. It was calm, controlled, final. A universal sign that said, stop. For a brief second, the world inside the arena seemed to hesitate with him. The referee instinctively moved closer, one hand half raised, unsure whether to halt the action or demand it continue. Officials at ringside exchanged quick glances. No one wanted to overstep. No one wanted to misread what was happening. This wasn't in the script. There was no protocol for a champion choosing pause over punishment. The opponent froze. He didn't advance. He didn't retreat. His gloves hung in front of his chest, unsure what role they were meant to play anymore. Fighters are trained to read bodies, to sense danger, to respond instantly. But there was nothing aggressive in Ali's posture. No trap, no bait. Just resolve. That uncertainty is disarming. The cameras locked on Ali's raised hand. The image spread across the big screens clear, undeniable. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't fatigue. This was intentional disruption. The officials hesitated because they understood what was at stake. Stopping a fight without cause could trigger outrage. Letting it continue against a fighter's clear refusal could invite disaster. Every second felt heavier than the last. Ali didn't speak yet. He didn't need to. The raised hand was enough to bend the moment, enough to pull the fight out of its violent rhythm and into something unfamiliar. It was the physical embodiment of choice, visible, undeniable, and deeply uncomfortable for a sport that thrives on inevitability. The crowd began to react not loudly, but emotionally. Some fans clapped uncertainly. Others shouted in protest. A few stood up, trying to see better, as if clarity might be found at a different angle. Everyone understood one thing. This was real. This was not scripted, not planned, not performative. There were no rehearsed words, no prearranged signal, no hidden agreement between corners. What was happening belonged to Ali alone, and that's what made it so powerful. In a world built around control-timed rounds, counted seconds, regulated damage, Muhammad Ali introduced something uncontrollable: conscience. By raising his hand, he claimed authority over the moment. Not as a champion asserting dominance, but as a human being asserting responsibility. And once that hand went up, there was no way to pretend this was just another fight. History had already stepped into the ring when Muhammad Ali finally spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout over the crowd. He didn't posture. He didn't perform. His tone was calm, steady, almost gentle. The kind of calm that doesn't ask for attention but commands it anyway. In a ring built for noise, his words landed softly, and because of that, they carried weight. Ali turned slightly toward the referee and then toward his opponent. He spoke plainly. No poetry, no bravado, no clever lines for the cameras. What he said was simple, unexpected. He told his opponent he didn't need to take more punishment, that continuing like this wasn't worth the damage, that there are things bigger than winning a round, bigger than satisfying a crowd hungry for violence. Those words stunned the arena not because they were loud, but because they didn't belong there. Boxing fans are used to trash talk, to intimidation. Two fighters promising pain and humiliation. They are not used to mercy spoken in the middle of a fight, not from a champion. Not with millions watching. Ali's authority came from his stillness, from the fact that he could continue and chose not to. There was no fear in his voice, no doubt, just conviction. The timing mattered. He didn't speak before the fight, when statements are easy. He didn't speak after the bell. When consequences fade, he chose the one moment when words cost the most, when action was expected, when pressure was highest, when stopping meant risking everything he had built. That choice transformed the announcement from sentiment into sacrifice. The crowd reacted in waves. At first, confusion. People leaned toward each other, asking what had just been said. Some shook their heads. Some laughed nervously. Others clapped instinctively. Sure why, but feeling that something important had occurred. Then came realization. A hush spread again, not forced, not demanded, but earned. People began to understand that they weren't witnessing weakness. They were witnessing restraint, and restraint, in this setting, felt almost radical. The opponent listened quietly. There was no anger in his response, no protest, just acknowledgement. Whatever words Ali spoke weren't meant to embarrass him, they were meant to protect him. That distinction mattered. Cameras captured faces in the crowd, disbelief, admiration, frustration, reflection. This was not the emotional response boxing usually produces. There was no single reaction to follow. People were processing in real time. Commentators lowered their voices. Their analysis softened. They stopped explaining punches and started grappling with meaning. This was no longer just about who would win or lose. It was about what had just been sedaned. Why it mattered. Ali didn't linger. He didn't repeat himself. Once the message was delivered, he let the silence do the rest. Because sometimes the most powerful announcement isn't meant to echo, it's meant to settle. The arena didn't erupt all at once. It fractured. Shock came first. Faces froze mid-expression. Mouths stayed open a second too long. People looked around as if expecting someone else to explain what had just happened. This wasn't the kind of moment fans were trained to process. Boxing delivers clarity. One man wins, the other loses. What had just unfolded fit neither category. Confusion followed quickly behind it. Some fans stood, pointing toward the ring, arguing with friends, replaying the moment in their heads. Others remained seated, arms crossed, trying to reconcile what they felt with what they had come to see. A fight was supposed to escalate, not pause for reflection. Then the reactions split. Applause broke out in pockets. Scattered at first, hesitant. A few claps here, a small group there. Not celebration, but recognition. People responding to something they didn't fully understand yet, but felt compelled to acknowledge. It wasn't loud. It didn't overpower the room. But it was real. At the same time, anger surfaced. Boos rose from other sections. Shouts of frustration cut through the noise. Some fans felt cheated. They had paid for violence, for resolution, for spectacle, and this wasn't it. To them, the interruption felt like denial. Like the rules of the night had been rewritten without their consent. Both reactions existed simultaneously. That's what made the moment so human inside the ring. The opponent reacted differently. He didn't lash out. He didn't protest. Instead, he stood quietly, gloves lowered now, breathing steady. The confusion on his face gave way to understanding. Whatever disappointment he might have felt was overshadowed by something else: relief, perhaps, or respect. Being the subject of mercy in front of a crowd is complicated, but it's not humiliating when it comes without cruelty. The referee looked unsettled. He glanced toward ringside officials, then back at the fighters. His job was to enforce rules, not interpret conscience. Yet he knew he was standing inside a moment that transcended protocol. He didn't rush. He didn't bark commands. He waited. Officials at ringside exchanged looks, brief, tense, uncertain. Conversations happened without words. They were calculating outcomes, responsibilities, consequences. No one wanted to be the one who mishandled a moment like this. The commentators, visible beyond the ropes, had stopped gesturing. Their faces mirrored the crowd's division, curiosity mixed with disbelief. They understood something rare had occurred, but struggled to place it inside the language of sport. And through it all, Muhammad Ali remained composed. He didn't gesture to the crowd. He didn't argue. He didn't seek approval. He stood there, calm amid chaos. As if the reaction, whatever it was, didn't change the necessity of what he had done. That contrast mattered. Because while the arena wrestled with emotion, Ali looked settled, certain, unmoved by applause or anger alike. In that moment, it became clear this wasn't a decision made for the crowd. It was a decision made despite them. In the commentary booth, everything fell apart at once. Moments earlier, the commentators had been comfortable, settled into the familiar language of jabs, footwork, and ring control. Their voices had rhythm, confidence. Boxing, after all, is predictable in structure, even when outcomes are uncertain. Now that structure was gone. Words overlapped. Sentences trailed off unfinished. One commentator began to describe what might be happening, only to stop mid-thought, realizing there was no comparison to reach for. Another searched for rule explanations, then abandoned the attempt entirely. This wasn't a technical issue. This wasn't strategy. This was something else. They tried to explain the unexplainable. Was Ali injured? No, he looked composed. Was this a misunderstanding? Unlikely his actions were deliberate. Was it gamesmanship? That didn't fit either. As the silence in the arena stretched, the tone in the booth shifted. Voices lowered. Pace slowed. The analysts stopped talking at the audience and started thinking with them. For perhaps the first time that night, commentators were not narrating events. They were witnessing them. One of them finally said what everyone was thinking: we don't see this. That acknowledgement changed everything. In live sports, commentators rarely admit uncertainty. Their role is to frame chaos into explanation. But here, explanation failed. The language of boxing couldn't contain what was unfolding in front of them. Then came the realization. This wasn't a strange moment. It was a historic one. You could hear it in their voices as it dawned on them. The hesitation gave way to gravity. The casual tone disappeared completely. They stopped discussing who was winning rounds or what adjustments might come next. Those questions suddenly felt small, irrelevant. Instead, they began to talk about meaning, about courage, about responsibility, about what it means for a champion to stop a fight not out of weakness, but out of conviction. One commentator pointed out how rare it was, not just in boxing, but in any sport, for an athlete to interrupt competition for moral reasons in the moment. Another noted that this decision would be debated long after the final result faded from memory. As they spoke, it became clear they understood something important. They were no longer covering a sporting event. They were documenting a statement. The cameras continued to roll. Producers likely whispered in headsets, scrambling to adjust framing, pacing, and narrative. No replay package could explain this. No graphic could summarize it. This was raw, unfolding history, and at the center of it all was Muhammad Ali not throwing punches. Not taunting an opponent, not chasing applause, but redefining what power looked like in real time. The commentary booth, usually the loudest voice in the room, grew quiet again, not because there was nothing to say, but because they finally understood. Some moments aren't meant to be explained immediately. They're meant to be remembered, to understand. Why Muhammad Ali stopped the fight, you have to look beyond the ring, beyond rankings, beyond titles. The answer doesn't live in strategy, it lives in values. Ali had never seen boxing as just a sport. For him, it was a platform, a stage where choices mattered because they were visible. Every action carried meaning, whether he intended it or not. By this point in his life, he understood that his influence extended far beyond who won or lost on the scorecards. At the core of Ali's decision was a deeply personal moral compass. He believed that strength wasn't measured only by what a man could endure or inflict, but by what he refused to do when he had the power to do it. That belief didn't come from comfort. It was forged through loss, criticism, sacrifice. Ali's faith played a central role. Faith for him wasn't ceremonial or performative. It was practical. It guided how he treated people, how he viewed suffering, and how he understood responsibility. He believed life was sacred and that unnecessary harm carried a cost that extended beyond applause or victory. Empathy followed naturally from that. Ali had been on both sides of punishment. He knew the toll repeated blows could take, not just in the moment, but years later. He understood how careers end quietly, how pain lingers long after crowds disappear. That awareness sharpened his sensitivity to what he was seeing in front of him. This wasn't about pity. It was about recognition. He saw a man absorbing damage that couldn't be undone, and in that moment, Ali recognized something more important than momentum: consequence. Conviction is hardest when it costs you something. Stopping the fight risked everything Ali had built. Fans could turn. Critics could attack. The narrative could shift from greatness to controversy overnight. But Ali had never been motivated by approval. He had already proven he could win fights. He had already proven he could dominate opponents. What he was proving now was something else entirely. That winning isn't always about finishing, that dominance without purpose is empty. That there are moments when restraint demands more courage than aggression. Ali didn't stop the fight because he was unsure. He stopped it because he was certain. Certain that continuing would serve spectacle, not justice. Certain that the crowd's hunger wasn't a moral obligation. Certain that his legacy would be measured by more than knockouts. In a sport built on endurance, Ali chose awareness. In a culture that rewards silence, he chose conscience. That's why winning wasn't the point that night, because Ali had already decided which. Victory mattered it wasn't one that could be counted. What Muhammad Ali did that night wasn't safe. It wasn't protected. And it certainly wasn't guaranteed to be remembered kindly by stopping the fight. Ali placed everything at risk. He could have lost the bout outright. Boxing doesn't reward hesitation, and it doesn't pause for moral reflection. Officials could have ruled against him. Records don't explain intent. They record outcomes. One decision, misunderstood or mishandled, could have rewritten the results on paper forever. He also risked losing the crowd. Fans are loyal until they feel denied. Many had paid to see dominance, not deliberation. To them, Ali's pause could be framed as refusal, arrogance, or disrespect for the sport. In boxing history, champions who break expectation are rarely forgiven quickly. Applause fades. Resentment lingers. Even worse, he risked damaging his career at this stage in his life. Ali didn't have the luxury of rebuilding public trust from scratch. Every fight mattered. Every performance shaped his legacy. Sponsors watched. Promoters calculated. Media waited for missteps. One controversial moment could shift the entire narrative from greatness to liability. Critics were already circling. Some believed he stayed too long. Others said he talked too much. Many were waiting for proof that his judgment was slipping. This moment handed them ammunition if they wanted it. So why didn't he care? Because Ali had already weighed those costs and dismissed them. He had faced consequences before. Real ones. Lost years of his prime. Lost income. Lost public support. And through all of it, he had learned something essential. Approval is temporary, but conscience stays. Ali didn't measure his life by comfort or consensus. He measured it by alignment between belief and action. And once he realized that continuing the fight violated that alignment, the risks became irrelevant. Losing a fight was survivable. Losing fans was temporary. Losing a career was possible. Losing himself was not. That's the part often missed. When moments like this are judged from the outside, people ask whether it was worth the controversy, worth the backlash, worth the uncertainty. But for Ali, the question wasn't, what will this cost me? It was, what will it cost me if I don't? In the ring that night, surrounded by noise, pressure, and expectation, Ali made a decision that insulated him from regret even if it exposed him to criticism. He chose the kind of risk that doesn't show up on scorecards, but shapes how a life is remembered, because some risks threaten success, others protect integrity, and Ali knew the difference. After the announcement, time seemed uncertain. Seconds stretched. Officials spoke quietly at ringside. The referee stood between the fighters, waiting for direction that never felt fully adequate. The rules of boxing are clear, but moments like this exist in the cracks between them. Eventually, a decision had to be made, whether the fight formally resumed or moved toward its conclusion. One truth was unavoidable. The energy had changed permanently. Whatever followed could not erase what had already happened. The interruption wasn't a pause, it was a turning point. If the action continued, it did so under a different weight. The punches no longer felt purely competitive. Every exchange carried awareness. The crowd watched differently now, not just for impact, but for intention. Cheers were quieter. Reactions slower. People were processing something larger than the fight itself. If the fight did not continue in the same way, if officials stepped in, or if momentum never truly returned, the ending felt unusual, almost anticlimactic. Not because it lacked drama, but because the drama had already peaked somewhere else. The climax wasn't a knockout or a final bell. It was a decision. Inside the ring, both fighters felt it. The opponent no longer pushed with the same urgency. Not out of weakness, but out of understanding. Being the subject of another man's restraint changes the psychology of competition. The fight was no longer about proving toughness. It had become about navigating a moment neither man had trained for. The referee's movements reflected that shift. He stayed closer, more attentive, less mechanical. His role had expanded beyond enforcing rules into protecting the integrity of what was unfolding. Every command carried extra care in the stands. The crowd never fully recovered its roar. Some fans tried to will the old energy back, clapping louder, shouting encouragement, but had never reached the same intensity. Others sat quietly, eyes fixed on the ring, aware they were watching something rare. Not just a sporting event, but a moral disruption. The cameras captured this change vividly. Faces that once showed excitement now showed contemplation. Applause came in shorter bursts. Even boos felt restrained, unsure of their target. The arena had shifted from consumption to reflection. That shift lingered. At the center of it all stood Muhammad Ali, composed as ever. Win or lose, continue or stop, no longer defined the night. Ali had already altered its meaning. The fight, in its traditional sense, had become secondary. The real contest, the one between expectation and conscience, had already been decided. When the moment finally passed and the ring moved toward resolution, it felt quieter than usual. Less explosive, but heavier. Because something had shifted that couldn't be reversed. The crowd didn't leave talking about combinations or scorecards. They left debating choice, responsibility, courage, and that's how you know the fight, as people expected it, was already over. By morning, the fight itself was almost an afterthought. Newspapers didn't lead with scorecards or round-by-round analysis. Sports shows didn't open with highlights of punches landed. Instead, headlines circled a single question: why did he stop? And the name attached to it dominated every conversation: Muhammad. Ali was everywhere. Front pages framed the moment in starkly different ways. Some called it unprecedented. Others called it controversial. A few used words like compassionate and courageous. More skeptical outlets questioned whether Ali had crossed a line, whether personal conscience belonged inside a professional fight. The divide was immediate. Supporters praised Ali for doing what no one else would. They argued that boxing, a sport built on damage, rarely pauses to ask whether damage is necessary. To them, Ali's decision represented maturity, proof that greatness evolves beyond physical dominance. Editorials spoke about responsibility, about leadership, about the power of choosing restraint in a culture addicted to spectacle. Critics were just as loud. They accused Ali of breaking the unwritten contract with fans, of undermining the sport, of turning a competitive event into a moral stage. Some questioned whether this set a dangerous precedent. What happens if fighters start stopping bouts based on personal judgment rather than rules? Radio hosts argued. Panel shows debated. Former fighters weighed in from opposite ends of the spectrum. Some said they wished someone had done the same for them earlier in their careers. Others insisted the ring is no place for hesitation. The sports world was split not along lines of loyalty, but philosophy: is boxing about winning at all costs? Or is it about knowing when the cost is too high? Ali's name anchored every version of the debate. His past was pulled into the present. Commentators revisited his history of controversial stands, reminding audiences that this wasn't an isolated incident, it was a pattern. Ali had always been willing to absorb backlash, if it meant staying true to himself. That context mattered, because it reframed the moment not as impulse, but as consistency. Even those who disagreed with him couldn't ignore the scale of the impact. This wasn't a footnote. It wasn't a curiosity. It was a disruption that forced the sport to look at itself, if only briefly. By the end of the day, one thing was clear. Ali had won the conversation, not by controlling it, by making it unavoidable. The fight had lasted minutes. The debate would last years, and as headlines moved on and schedules filled with the next event, this moment refused to settle neatly into history. It lingered, unresolved, challenging fans, fighters, and officials alike. That's the kind of ripple only certain actions create, the kind that doesn't fade with the next news cycle, the kind that follows a name, especially when that name is Muhammad Ali. The reaction didn't stay inside the arena, even inside one country. Within hours, the moment had crossed borders. By the next day, it had gone global. Fans around the world responded in deeply personal ways. For many, Muhammad Ali became something more than a champion that night. Letters poured in, some handwritten, some read aloud on radio shows, thanking him for doing what no one else had dared to do. Parents wrote about sons who boxed. Wives wrote about husbands who never stopped fighting, even when they should have. Former fighters spoke about damage they wished someone had spared them. To these people, Ali's decision felt like validation, proof that toughness didn't have to mean silence. That stopping could be an act of strength, not surrender. In gyms, classrooms, and living rooms, people replayed the footage and said the same thing in different words. He did the right thing. But the reaction was not universally warm. Others were furious. Some fans felt betrayed, not emotionally, but culturally. Boxing to them was sacred precisely because it was uncompromising. They believed Ali had broken the spirit of the sport. Call-in shows lit up with accusations of selfishness, showmanship, and arrogance. Why should one man's conscience override a competition built on endurance? That anger wasn't shallow. It was ideological. People weren't just arguing about Ali. They were arguing about what sport is supposed to be. About whether spectatorship grants entitlement. About whether tradition should ever yield to empathy. Debates broke out everywhere. In newspapers, on television panels, in barbershops and boxing gyms. Was Ali protecting his opponent or patronizing him? Was this courage or control? Was this progress or disrespect for the sport? Interviews amplified the divide. Former champions weighed in. Trainers shared stories of fighters who absorbed punishment because no one stopped them. Doctors spoke about long-term brain damage. Philosophers and cultural commentators stepped in, reframing the moment as something larger than sports. And that's why people couldn't stop talking. Because the moment refused to sit comfortably in any single category. It wasn't purely heroic. It wasn't purely controversial. It wasn't easily explained away. It forced people to confront their own assumptions about violence, entertainment, and responsibility. Fans who had never questioned the brutality of boxing suddenly found themselves defending it. Others, who loved the sport deeply, admitted they had never seen it challenged from the inside like this. Ali didn't offer answers. He offered a mirror, and mirrors make people uncomfortable. Weeks later, long after the fight faded from highlight reels, the conversations continued. Not because of how the bout ended, but because of how it was interrupted, across cultures, languages, and beliefs. One thing was clear. Muhammad Ali had given the world something to argue about and something to think about. And that, more than applause or outrage, is how you know a moment mattered. When the noise faded and the argument settled into history, one truth remained clear. This moment revealed who Muhammad Ali really was. Not just a boxer. Ali had already proven his greatness with his fists. Titles, wins. Iconic fights, those credentials were secure long before this night. What unfolded in the ring didn't add to his record. It added to his identity. This was the difference. Many athletes win. Very few lead. Ali showed that leadership doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it appears as refusal, as restraint, as the willingness to disappoint people who came expecting something simpler. By stopping the fight, Ali stepped outside the role assigned to him. He wasn't acting as an entertainer, a product, or even just a competitor. He was acting as a moral agent, someone willing to absorb backlash so that another person didn't have to absorb more damage. That takes a specific kind of courage. Not the courage to fight through pain, but the courage to stop when everyone expects you to continue. Physical bravery is celebrated in boxing. It's rewarded. It's applauded. Moral bravery, especially when it disrupts tradition, is far rarer and far more costly. Ali accepted that cost without hesitation. This moment also showed how Ali understood power. Power, to him, wasn't about domination. It wasn't about humiliating an opponent or proving superiority at all costs. It was about responsibility, about recognizing when you have control and choosing how to use it. That perspective separated him from most champions. Where others saw opportunity, Ali saw consequence. Where others chased closure through victory, he recognized closure through decision. He understood that influence carries weight, that how you wield it defines you more than how often you win. Leadership through action is the hardest kind to dismiss. Ali didn't lecture the crowd. He didn't demand agreement. He didn't explain himself in slogans. He acted. And in doing so, he forced everyone else, fans, fighters, officials, commentators, to confront what they believed about strength. That's why this moment lingered. It didn't rely on charisma or rhetoric. It relied on integrity expressed in real time, under pressure, with no safety net. The ring wasn't a metaphor that night. It was a test, and Ali passed it on terms that had nothing to do with the scorecards. History often reduces people to symbols. Ali resisted that reduction by continuing to complicate his own story. He refused to be remembered as only a fighter. He insisted through action that he be remembered as a human being first. And that's what this moment revealed most clearly. Muhammad Ali's greatness wasn't confined to what he could do to others. It lived in what he refused to do, even when the world expected it. That night in the ring didn't come out of nowhere for Muhammad Ali. Choosing conscience over applause was not an exception, it was a pattern. A through line that ran quietly, stubbornly, through his entire life. Years earlier, the height of his physical prime, Ali had already shown the world what it looked like to stand alone. When he refused to be drafted into the Vietnam War, he didn't do it quietly or strategically. He did it openly, knowing full well what it would cost him. Titles stripped. Years of his career erased. Public opinion turned sharply against him. That decision wasn't popular. It wasn't safe. And it certainly wasn't profitable, but it was consistent. Ali had always believed that. Personal belief mattered more than public approval. When faced with choices that demanded silence in exchange for comfort, he chose discomfort. He chose consequence. He chose to live with the fallout rather than with regret. There were smaller moments to less famous. But just as revealing, Ali often showed compassion toward opponents, others dismissed. He spoke openly about the damage boxing inflicted, even while participating in it. He treated rivals with unexpected kindness after brutal fights, embracing men he had just defeated, reminding them and the audience that they were more than entertainers. These actions didn't fit the stereotype of a ruthless champion. They confused people who wanted simple heroes and villains. Ali refused simplicity. Standing alone became familiar to him. When crowds booed, he stood. When media mocked, he smiled. When institutions punished him, he endured. The night he stopped the fight followed the same logic. Once again, Ali was willing to be misunderstood in the short term to remain aligned in the long term. Once again, he prioritized the quiet approval of his conscience over the loud reaction of the crowd. That repetition matters, because patterns reveal character more clearly than isolated acts. Ali didn't suddenly become reflective or merciful later in life. He had always been that way, just expressed it differently as his experiences deepened. The ring moment wasn't a break from who he was. It was an extension of it. Each time, Ali chose principle. The reaction followed the same arc: shock, anger, debate, eventual admiration. History kept catching up to him, even when the present couldn't. And that's the risk of conscience. It's rarely understood immediately. Applause is instant. Understanding takes time. Ali accepted that delay. He trusted that meaning outlasts noise. That integrity ages better than popularity. So when he raised his hand in the ring and stopped the fight, he wasn't improvising morality. He was repeating it, doing what he had always done, standing alone so others wouldn't have to. This moment didn't survive because of the fight. It survived because of the decision. Most boxing matches fade with time. Scores blur. Opponents are forgotten. Even great performances eventually become highlights, compressed into seconds and archived away. But what Muhammad Ali did that night refused to shrink, because history doesn't cling to outcomes. It clings to choices. The punches thrown that night were not unusual. The decision to stop everything it interrupted the expected arc of competition and replaced it with something harder to categorize. That discomfort is exactly why the moment endured. It wasn't about skill. It wasn't about dominance. It wasn't even about victory. It was about responsibility. It's exercised at the point of maximum pressure. That's rare. Most people wait until consequences pass before they speak. Ali spoke when consequences were immediate. When cameras were live, when reversal wasn't possible, that timing gave the moment its permanence. History remembers people who act. When silence is easier, Ali's decision forced the sport and its audience to confront uncomfortable truths. About damage, about entitlement, about the thin line between courage and cruelty. Those questions don't age out. They resurface every time another fighter is hurt. Every time another spectacle demands sacrifice. That's why this moment still resonates. It serves as a reference point. When debates arise about safety in sports, Lee's name returns. When discussions about athlete responsibility surface, this moment is cited. It's not used as a rule, but as a reminder that rules alone don't cover every ethical boundary. The lesson isn't that every fight should stop. The lesson is that blind continuation is not strength. Ali demonstrated that power includes the ability to refuse to say enough when everyone else wants more. That lesson applies far beyond boxing. It speaks to leadership, to decision-making, two moments when momentum pressures us to ignore consequence. For younger generations, this moment reframes Ali's legacy, not just as a fighter who talked beautifully and moved brilliantly, but as a man who understood when winning was no longer the point, a man willing to interrupt spectacle for principle. Time has been kind to that decision. What once seemed confusing now feels clarifying. What once divided opinion now invites respect even from those who disagree. The noise of the immediate reaction faded. The clarity of the choice remained. That's how history works. It doesn't reward perfection. It rewards alignment. And that night, Muhammad Ali aligned action with belief in a way that refused to be forgotten. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. In the end, the fight became background noise. Not because it didn't matter, but because something else mattered more. We're taught to admire force, to celebrate endurance, to praise those who keep going no matter the cost. In boxing, that lesson is amplified. Pain is normalized. Damage is expected. Stopping is treated as failure. But that night, Muhammad Ali challenged that belief in the most unforgiving place possible. He showed that power isn't always about throwing punches. Sometimes power is the ability to stop everything when no one else wants you to. It takes strength to fight through pain. It takes more strength to recognize when pain no longer serves a purpose. Ali understood that difference. He didn't act out of fear. He didn't act out of weakness. He acted out of clarity. In a ring built for dominance, he chose dignity. In a moment designed for spectacle, he chose conscience. And in doing so, he redefined what courage looked like, not just for boxers, but for anyone watching. This is why his legacy stretches beyond belts and records. Because titles expire, highlight reels fade, but decisions rooted in principle endure. That night reminds us that leadership isn't always loud, that bravery doesn't always look like aggression, and that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is refuse to continue on terms that betray who they are. We remember Muhammad Ali not because he never lost, but because he knew when winning wasn't the point. And that lesson still matters. In leadership, in life, that night, Muhammad Ali didn't win with his fists. He won with his soul. If you want more untold stories that reveal the man behind the legend, moments that go beyond the highlights and into the heart, subscribe, because some stories aren't about how hard someone hit. They're about when they chose not to.